Episode 4, My Conversation with Eric Donoho.
Are you going to quit in your head? Is the stress of the situation going to get to be too much and you're going to just quit? It doesn't mean that you don't show up. You have to show up. But in your head, you're just done. You've quit. Your body is there. You're physically there, but mentally you've checked out of the game.
I'm Paul Estridge, and this is Survive in Advance, a show from the People Forward Network. Let's learn to face life's greatest challenges and move forward together. What does it take to survive in war? More importantly, what does it take to keep going when you're convinced you won't survive? When Eric Donoho joined the military at 26, he knew he was going to war. On his first patrol in Iraq, his Humvee was rocked by an IED buried in the road. Eric knew at that moment there was a chance he would never go home. In our conversation, Eric vulnerably shares what it was like to live every day believing you would die and still find a way to keep going.
Fall of 2004, I joined as an airborne infantry guy, knowing that as soon as I get out of training, I'm likely going to go to war. I was down in Fort Benning, in between basic training and airborne school, where I learned that I was getting stationed at a new brigade in Alaska called the 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division. Shortly after that, after getting there, about 6 months in, I got asked to join the Scout Sniper Platoon. And then in fall of October 2006, I deployed to Iraq. And from that point, that's when what was a very blessed life got kind of turned upside down. I arrived in Kuwait, and we unloaded the bags of the plane and all that kind of stuff. And we went to a place called Camp Buehring in Kuwait. And upon arriving at Camp Buehring, I had a Red Cross message waiting for me that let me know that my wife and I had just lost our 7.5-month-old child. Upon getting that Red Cross message, I got back onto a bus and headed back to the airport, flew home, and because of some amazing leadership, friends and mentors, I was able to get home just in time for the stillbirth of David. We buried him at Fort Richardson National Cemetery, and then about a week and a half later, I got back on a plane and flew back to Iraq. And by the time that I met up with my platoon, I went out on my first night mission, and I got blown up by an IED.
When you say you got blown up, please explain that.
So an IED is short for an improvised explosive device. Basically, the people fighting us, the insurgents, they buried a bomb under the road. Luckily, they buried it too deep on that one, and the earth took most of the impact. But it shook the Humvee, cracked some of the windows. But by all counts, we were pretty good. And as far as concussives, as blasts go, it was very minimal because they buried it so deep. For me, it was this immediate realization with death all around me that the likelihood of me coming home would probably be slim.
Did you really have that thought at that point in time?
Yeah, I didn't think I was going to make it back. Not one bit of me. Still to this day, I can remember the shock of knowing that my tour is over and I'm headed home and I made it. Mainly just because we were always out working. IEDs and what is called an EFP, which is the same thing as an IED, but a little bit stronger. An EFP stands for explosively formed penetrator or projectile. Picture a manhole cover for a sewer on the roads, those big pieces of metal. you would tilt that up and pack a whole bunch of explosives behind it. And when those explosives go off, it turns that manhole cover into a solid slug meant to go through 10 inches of armor. So those were killing soldiers left and right. I mean, as much as you looked for them and you tried to do a good job, I never saw one that I didn't hit. So I just kind of resigned to this idea that I wasn't going to make it home. As we start getting into the groove of things, right around Christmas of 2006, we got orders that the Marines needed a rescue up in Fallujah because Al Qaeda had a decent stronghold in that area, and Marines were really focused on Fallujah, and some of the out areas were where all these insurgents were going to, and so areas that hadn't typically been so bad had really gotten horrible, and so they asked us to come up and help out. And so I ended up getting attached to the Marines for about 9-10 months and fighting in a place called Karma, Iraq, of all names. And that's where I got hit by my second ID, which happened on Valentine's Day 2007. And that one was not buried very deep and blew open the door on the Humvee, and I was knocked unconscious for, I don't know, less than a minute, but it was good enough that the people around me told me they thought I was dead. And then I kind of just popped open and closed my door and like went straight into what I should have been doing as far as reaction to it. And then remember looking over at my LT, mouthing the word stop because I couldn't hear him. And that was the next thing I remember. And that was when I started getting migraines and started having trouble putting in sentences together and talking and a number of other different things, not thinking as clearly. But it was right near the end of our deployment. We were about 2.5-3 weeks away from deploying home, and we went out to a city called Iskandariya where a riot was happening, and had to embed with the Iraqi police for a few days. And it was the second night there that we were driving, doing our patrols, and we got hit with a EFP. That one was the one that did the most damage, I think, to my brain as far as noticeable and immediate. And so we went back to the police station that night and stayed there. And then the next morning, the guys in the Humvee that were in the Humvee with me, we all went back to Fob Kalsu, got checked out. That's where I got awarded a Purple Heart, which at the time I didn't really want to accept because, to me, a Purple Heart is you lose a limb, you get shot, and think a brain injury was something you should get a Purple Heart for. But me and the other guys I was with that ended up getting a Purple Heart, we were having a hard time accepting that, but we all knew and that this would probably affect us long term, and it did.
Was this right before you came home?
Right before we came home. So we got 48 hours to recover on base, and we went back out with our platoon. Came back 2 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, we were on our way out of country. When I got home, they did what's called a post-health assessment based on the media generation that was going on with traumatic brain injuries, and I scored off the charts for traumatic brain injury. Of course, PTSD, which is a commonplace thing when you have a
Aren't
pain.
those two different things?
They are, but they usually go hand in hand. If you can have PTSD separate from a brain injury, but typically if you have a brain injury, you're probably going to have some PTSD that goes along with that brain injury. So usually if you get diagnosed with TBI, in a lot of cases, you'll most likely get diagnosed with PTSD too. Now, there are cases in life where, it can be you went out and slipped and fell and, hit your head and got a brain injury. And those situations, you're not going to get diagnosed with PTSD. I mean, but you could have it. But I think a large part they go hand in hand because your brain is trying to process all the things that you've seen and done and laid witness to. But on the same token, your brain is damaged and it's trying to heal itself. And so it's kind of like a record player that kind of skips as you're trying to listen to the song, or a CD that gets scratched and it just gets stuck and it's just playing it over and over again. And in large part, that's, how I think or why the two go hand in hand.
Were there moments that you had to survive where you said, I survived that?
So one of the scenarios that come to mind in talking about moments where I think your training, your mental toughness, your discipline, and everything inside, needs to remain calm and steady to survive a situation more so than the bombs going off. I can think of, we were set up in a building doing what's called IED interdiction. And so we would move in at night undercover, set up in an abandoned building or house on the roof, inside, hidden, and at areas where there were high amounts of IEDs being put in. And our job was to watch, and if somebody were to come along to put in an IED, neutralize the threat. So we were in a situation where we were in a building and we were watching an individual walk over to put in a mortar round to set as an IED. And when we took the shot to neutralize the threat, what we didn't realize, and I don't think any of us really realized, was that it was somewhat close to a what I can only describe as like a hangout for terrorists. I don't know if it was a stronghold or they were just all happened to be hanging out there that day, but like it just went all to shit as soon as that shot went off.
What happened?
Well, all of a sudden, guys started filing out of this little compound across the street and started shooting at the building that we were in, because once you shoot, you give up your location, you give up the secrecy of where you're at. And we were a small team out there, so we had to call our QRF, which is our quick reaction force, to come in and get us.
They came in through Humvees.
They came in Humvees on the road system, and we were kind of in a building a little ways back from the road, far enough to give us cover, but long enough to, have some pretty scary, intense situations into getting to your pickup and your ride. And so we needed to make it, I don't know, I mean, it wasn't a ton of space, maybe 1,200 meters, something along those lines, 1,000 meters. But you're going from building to building and you're doing what's, you've trained to do: shoot, move, and communicate, and get out to the road. And we finally make it to the Humvees. And so all this mayhem is going on, and we all get out of there unscathed. No one's hurt. No one's injured. I mean, it was a remarkable scenario that no one got hurt, even from just the running and the chaotic and all of that.
What do you attribute no one getting hurt to?
A number of things. First and foremost, I think that we had some people looking out for us above. I am somebody who believes in that and believes those things. But I also know that the guys that I worked with in Iraq are some of the most amazing human beings in this world. And we trained together 14 hours a day, every day, for months on end. When you have that close of a bond with guys, that you're just able to make the impossible happen. And my platoon, every single person, whether I liked them or they liked me, was irrelevant. We were all brothers, and we worked together, and we had each other's back. So that's what I attribute it to. When I got done with that experience and the adrenaline started to calm down, and you start to think about what you just overcame, you realize how fragile life can really be. And you learn to start enjoying those little moments that most people take for granted. The moment where your buddy, comes up and gives you a wet willy and it pisses you off, and he's smiling and laughing. And what you picture in your head is that smiling and laughing of him and thinking about what you're going to do to get him back later, because it isn't all the time that you make it out unscathed. And so if you don't enjoy those little moments, I think you don't have any of that real pleasure and joy in life that people are really searching for and looking for.
When you think back to all the people that you met, who makes it? Who survives war and who doesn't survive war? Are there any characteristics? Are there any perspectives or any views or anything internally about people that allows them to make it through?
That is a fantastic question. And I think it really is kind of more of a two-part answer, because when you're encompassing war, you have to think about the actual act of war, and then you have to think about coming home, because that's a part of leaving war behind and then getting back to life as we know it. So let's dive into the first part about actual war and who makes it and who doesn't. And the truth is, I think in the infantry world, and again, I'm not a special forces guy, I'm not a tier 1. I would have loved to get the opportunity to try, but I didn't. And so I don't know if I would have made it or not. But I know that I had one attribute that made it more than likely that I would have been able to make it, which is that I wouldn't quit. And I think that is the biggest definer in who makes it through war and who doesn't, is, are you going to quit in your head? Or is the stress of the situation going to get to be too much and you're going to just quit? When I say quitting, it doesn't mean that you don't show up. You have to show up. But in your head, you're just done. You've quit. Your body is there. You're physically there, but mentally you've checked out of the game. You've quit. You've had enough. You're done. You want to go home. When you've hit that point, and I think it's incumbent on good leaders in the military, especially in war, to recognize when people hit that front. A lot of that has to do with the second question, which is, who survives war when you come home? And that one goes back to a number of different factors, like from example of, what kind of home life did you grow up in when you were a kid? How many head injuries did you have from playing sports or car accidents? How many traumatic incidences have you already had seen or experienced in your life beforehand? And how did you deal with those then? In large part, I think that was the part that I didn't have, that I was missing personally. I made it and had it, I'm not going to quit mindset. But when you have the I'm not going to quit mindset, you also have to be able to process everything healthy. War, you just need to know you can't quit. Mentally, you got to show up every day. You got to give 110%, and you got to know or believe it's making a difference in the people's lives to your right or left.
You came home. You chose retirement. How did that go?
Well, I'll put it this way. Like any working dog, you don't do good in times of quiet. If you're a worker, you got to have purpose. You got to have some sort of drive. And in the beginning, we had some challenges in my wife's health and in where we were going. So I had purpose and drive. And then my daughter came into the picture, and I felt like I had some purpose and drive. But when I realized that that would only last for so long and that I wasn't growing as an individual, that's when the shadows of war, depression, all of those things start coming in, because you're watching everyone else, or you're perceiving that everyone else is moving on and being successful, and all you're doing is just taking care of this child. And for me, that was a really hard grasp to get around, because I didn't see being a stay-at-home parent in the same light as moving forward in my career, or being successful in some industry, or doing something along those lines. And so ultimately, in the end, I just didn't have the foundation built. And I know you can appreciate this. And I come from a father who's a contractor. So for me, it's a lot easier to think of things as in building houses or buildings. I looked around and I had realized that the foundation that I had built my life on was crumbling. And when that happens, you have two options. You can jack up the house, or you can tear it down. And I decided to do a third option, which was to not just tear it down, but to systematically take it apart in a way that I could put it back together when I was ready for that foundation to be put there. Meaning, a lot of veterans, when they choose that option of destroying it and starting over, they look at this life as they have, that it's got to go away. They get divorced, blah, blah, blah. And in that second marriage, they find that redemption because they've fixed their foundation first. I didn't want that second relationship. I still wanted the first one that I had. I just knew that if I tried to lift it up, that it wasn't good enough built to withstand that jacking up. So I carefully took it down. We redid the foundation, and that was in 2016. And ever since, I've just systematically been rebuilding the house.
With all the things that you faced at war and coming home, how do you keep going?
When I realized that death became this real possibility that was going to happen, you're faced with this question: how do you move forward in the face of death? Which is the hardest question to answer, but one that all of us will have to answer for ourselves at some point. And so for me, I looked at it in a very simple way, and I've had to answer this question multiple times in my life. The first time I had to answer it was at war, and I decided that there was no way that I was going to do anything or be the cause of any reason that my brothers died. And so for me, all that I could do is operate at the best of my ability at all times in order to be performing my best. Later in life, when I was faced with death, I tried to embrace it, only to find out that death is reserved for those when God has no more plans for us here on earth. And until that point happens, while we're alive, what we should be trying to search for is that purpose. And if we're having trouble seeing it, identifying it, well, that's when you got to lean on those around you the most to help you figure it out. And all I can say is the only option that you have is to move forward.
One of the principles of survival that you'll hear about this season is never quit. And we hear this coming through very clearly in Eric's story, that what allowed him to endure the grind of war was to, first of all, and maybe more than anything else, is to have a mindset of never quitting. Regardless of how difficult it got, quitting was never going to be an option. Now that's war. It's easy to understand the application of never quitting when faced with the fierceness of war. But what about our everyday experiences? What about when Eric came home and had to live his life dealing with the challenges of transition from war to normal life? It was difficult. It's difficult for you, it's difficult for me, it's difficult for so many of us. And we still have to maintain this commitment to never quit. One of the other principles that Eric touches on is purpose. In Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, the word meaning is synonymous with purpose. What is our purpose? What is the reason for our life? And in the most difficult of times, when we are in the midst of survival, it's critically important that we have a sense of our purpose, why we exist, why we were created, why we are born, what our life is supposed to mean. Our purpose will pull us like a magnet of meaning in our lives through the most difficult times if we've identified it. And if we haven't identified it, it's critical that we do. As we wrap up this episode today, I have 2 questions for you. 1, do you know your purpose? 2, are you a quitter? Thanks for listening to Survive and Advance, a show from the People Forward Network. I'm Paul Estridge, reminding you to keep moving forward and always be grateful. Let's stay connected. Send me an email at surviveandadvance@estridge.net.